Hello, this is session 5 of Secret Garden. This will be starting on page 147 if you're in the same book that I am. Chapter 15, called Nest Building. After another week of rain, the high arch of blue sky appeared again, and the sun, which poured down, was quite hot. Though there had been no chance to see either the secret garden or Dickon, Mistress Mary had enjoyed herself very much. The week had not seemed long. She'd spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking about Rajas or gardens or Dickon and the cottage on the moor. They had looked at the splendid books and pictures, and sometimes Mary had read things to Colin, and sometimes he read a little to her. When he was amused and interested, she thought he scarcely looked like an invalid at all, except that his face was so colorless, and he was always on the sofa. "You are a sly one, young one, to listen and get out of your bed to go following things up like you did that night," Mrs. Medlock said once. "But there's no saying, it's not been sort of a blessing to the lot of us. He's not had a tantrum or a whining fit since you made friends. The nurse was just going in to give up the case because she was sick of him. But she says she doesn't mind staying now that you've gone on duty with her," laughing a little. In her talks with Colin, Mary had tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. There were certain things she wanted to find out from him, but she felt that she must find them out without asking him direct questions. In the first place, as she began to like to be with him, she wanted to discover whether he was the kind of boy you could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dickon, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden no one knew anything about that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. But she had not known him long enough to be sure. The second thing she wanted to find out was this: if he could be trusted, if he really could, wouldn't it be possible to take him to the garden without having anyone find it out? The grand doctor had said that he must have fresh air. And Colin had said that he would not mind fresh air in the secret garden. Perhaps if he had a great deal of fresh air and knew Dickon and the robin and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. Mary had seen herself in the glass sometimes lately when she realized she looked quite a different creature from the child she had seen when she arrived from India. This child looked nicer. Even Martha had seen a change in her. "The air from the moor has done thee good already," she said. "They're not so yellow and not so scrawny. Even the hair doesn't slant down on their head so flat. It's got some life in it, so it sticks out a bit." "It's like me," said Mary. "It's growing stronger and fatter. I'm sure there's more of it." "It looks it for sure," said Martha, ruffling it up a little around her face. "Thou aren't half so ugly when it's that way, and there's a bit of red in your cheeks." If gardens and fresh air had been good for her, perhaps they would be good for Colin. But then, if he hated people to look at him, perhaps he would not like to see Dickon. "Why does it make you angry when you are looked at?" she inquired one day. "I always hated it," he answered, "even when I was very little. Then when they took me to the seaside and I used to lie in my carriage, everybody used to stare, and ladies would stop and talk to my nurse, and then they would begin to whisper, and I knew they were saying that I shouldn't live to grow up. Then sometimes the ladies would pat my cheeks and say, 'Poor child.' Once when a lady did that, I screamed out loud and I bit her hand. She was so frightened, she ran away." "She thought you had gone mad like a dog," said Mary, not at all admiringly. "I don't care what she thought," said Colin, frowning. "I wonder why you didn't scream and bite me when I came into your room," said Mary. And then she began to smile slowly. "I thought you were a ghost or a dream," he said. "You can't bite a ghost or a dream, and if you scream, they don't care." "Would you hate it if a boy looked at you?" Mary asked uncertainly. He lay back on his cushion and paused thoughtfully. "There's one boy," he said quite slowly, as if he were thinking over every word. "There's one boy I believe I shouldn't mind. It's that boy who knows where the foxes live. Dickon." "I'm sure you wouldn't mind him," said Mary. "The birds don't, and the other animals, he said, still thinking it over. Perhaps that's why I shouldn't. He's a sort of an animal charmer, and I'm a boy animal. Then he laughed, and she laughed too. In fact, it ended in their both laughing a great deal and finding the idea of a boy animal hiding in his hole very funny indeed. What Mary felt afterward was that she need not fear about Dickon. On that first morning when the sky was blue again, Mary awakened very early. The sun was pouring in slanting rays through the blinds, and there was something so joyous in the sight of it that she jumped out of bed and ran to the window. She drew up the blinds and opened the window itself, and a great waft of fresh, scented air blew in upon her. The moor was blue, and the whole world looked as if something magic had happened to it. There were tender little fluting sounds here and there, and everywhere, as if scores of birds were beginning to tune up for a concert. Mary put her hand out of the window and held it up in the sun. "It's warm, warm," she said. "It'll make the green points push up, and it will make the bulbs and the roots work and struggle with all their might under the earth." She kneeled down and leaned out of the window as far as she could, breathing big breaths and sniffing the air until she laughed, because she remembered what Dickon's mother had said about the end of the nose quivering like a rabbit's. "It must be very early," she said. "The little clouds are all pink, and I've never seen the sky look like this. No one is up. I don't even hear the stable boys." A sudden thought made her scramble to her feet. "I can't wait. I'm going to see the garden." She had learned to dress herself by this time, and she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small side door which she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall. She unchained and unbolted and unlocked. When the door was open, she sprang across the step with one bound. And there she was, standing on the grass, which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her and warm, sweet wafts about her, and the fluting and twittering and singing coming from every bush and tree. She clasped her hands for pure joy and looked up in the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and flooded with springtime light that she felt as if she must flute and sing aloud herself, and knew that thrushes and robins and skylarks could not possibly help it. She ran around the shrubs and paths towards the secret garden. "It is different already," she said. "The grass is greener, and things are sticking up everywhere, and things are uncurling, and green buds of leaves are showing. This afternoon, I am sure Dickon will come." The long warm rain had done strange things to the herbaceous beds which bordered the walk by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing out from the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal purple and yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before, Mistress Mary would not have seen how the world was waking up, but now she missed nothing. When she reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy, she was startled by a curious loud sound. It was the caw of a crow, and it came from the top of the wall, and when she looked up, there was a big, glossy plumaged, blue-black bird, looking down at her wisely indeed. She'd never seen a crow so close before, and he made her a little nervous. But the next moment he spread his wings and flapped away across the garden. She hoped he was not going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open, wondering if he would. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he probably did intend to stay, because he alighted on a dwarf apple tree, and under the apple tree was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail, and both of them were watching the stooping body and the rust-red hair of Dickon, who was kneeling on the grass, working hard. Mary flew across the grass to him. "Dickon, Dickon," she cried, "how could you get here so early? How could you? The sun's only just got up." He got up of himself, laughing and glowing and tousled, his eyes like a bit on the sky. "Oh," he said, "I was up long before him. How could I have stayed in bed? The world's all fair begun again this morning, it has, and it's working on hummin' and scratching and piping and nest building and breathing out sense, till you've got to be out of it, instead of lying on your back. When the sun did jump up, The moor went mad for joy, and I was in the midst of the heather, and I ran like mad myself, shouting and singing. And I come straight here. I couldn't have stayed away. Why, the garden was lying here waiting. Mary put her hands on her chest, panting as if she had been running herself. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon," she replied. "I am so happy I can scarcely breathe." Seeing him talking to a stranger, the little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree and came to him, and the rook, cawing once, flew down from its branch and settled quietly on his shoulder. "This is a little fox cub," he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. "It's named Captain. And this here's Soot. Soot, he flew across the moor with me, and Captain, he run same as if thousands had been after him. They both felt the same as I did." Neither of the creatures looked as if he were the least bit afraid of Mary. When Dickon began to walk about, Soot stayed on his shoulder and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. "See here," said Dickon. "See how these has pushed up, and these, and oh, look at these here." He threw himself upon his knees, and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon a whole clump of crocuses, burst into purple and orange and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. "You never kiss a person in that way," she said when she lifted her head. "Flowers are so different." He looked puzzled, but smiled. "Ah," he said, "I kissed my mother many a time that way when I come in from the moor after a day of roaming, and she stood there at the door in the sun looking so glad and comfortable." They ran from one part of the garden to another and found so many wonders that they were obliged to remind themselves that they must whisper or speak low. He showed her swelling leaf buds on rose branches, which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green points pushing through the mold. They put their eager young noses to the earth and sniffed its warm springtime. Breathing, they dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture, until Mistress Mary's hair was as tumbled as Dickon's, and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly, something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner, a little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dickon stood quite still and put his hand on Mary, almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in church. "We mustn't stir," he whispered in broad Yorkshire. "We must not scare a breeze. I knowed he was mate hunting when I seed him. It's Ben Weatherstaff's robin. He's building his nest. He'll stay here if we don't fight him." They settled down softly on the grass and sat there without moving. "Us mustn't seem as if we're watching him too close," said Dickon. "He'd be out with us for good if he got the notion that we were interfering now. He'll be a good bit different till all this is over. He's setting up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things ill. He's got no time for visiting and gossiping. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if we're just grass and trees and bushes. Then when he's got used to us, I'll chirp a bit and he'll know is not being his way." Mistress Mary was not at all sure what she saw and what she knew, as Dickon seemed to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes, but he had said the queer thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be quite easy to him, and indeed she watched him for a few minutes, carefully wondering if it was possible for him to quietly turn green and put out branches and leaves. But he sat only wonderfully still, and when he spoke, dropped his voice to such softness that it was curious that he could hear him. But she could. "It's part of springtime, this nest building is," he said. "I warrant it's been going on the same way every year since the world has begun. They've got their way of thinking and doing things in body and had better not meddle. You can lose a friend in springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious." "If we talk about him, I can't help looking at him," Mary said as softly as possible. "We must talk of something else. There's something I want to tell you." "He'll like it better if us talks of something else," said Dickon. What is it that you got to tell me? Well, do you know about Colin? She whispered. He turned his head to look at her. What do you know about him? He asked. I've seen him. I've been to talk to him every day this week. He wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying, answered Mary. Dickon looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. I'm glad of that, he exclaimed. I'm right glad. It makes me easier. I knowed I must say nothing about him, and I don't like having to hide things. Don't you like hiding the garden? Said Mary. I've never tell about it, he answered, but I says to Mother, Mother, I got a secret to keep. It's not a bad one that knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest is. Thou doesn't mind it, does that? Mary always wanted to hear about Mother. Well, what did she say? She asked, not at all afraid to hear. Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly. I was just like her. What she said, he answered. She give me a head a bit of a rub and laughed as she says, Ah, lad, you can have all the secrets you like. I know thee there's 12 years. How did you know about Colin? Asked Mary. Everybody has knowed about Master Craven, knowed there was a little lad as like to be a cripple, and they knowed Master Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Master Craven, because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady that was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children, because she knows us has been brought up to be trusty. How do you find out about him? Martha was in fine trouble the last time she came home. She said she heard him fretting and then was asking questions, and she didn't know what to say. Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind, which had wakened her, and about the faint, far-off sounds of a complaining voice, which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and she ended up with opening the door of the dimly lit room with the carved four-poster bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head. Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say. They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake because his eyes is so much like his mother's, and yet looks so different in his miserable bit of a face. Do you think he wants him to die? Whispered Mary. No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother, she says, the worst thing on earth for a child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven, he'd buy anything his money could buy for that poor lad, but he'd like to forget as he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him some day and find that he's growed a hunchback. Colin's so afraid of himself that he won't sit up, said Mary. He says he's always thinking that if he should feel a lump coming, he'd go crazy and scream himself to death. He ought not to lie there thinking things like that, said Dickon. No lad could get well as thought him sort of things. The fox was lying on the grass close by him, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked around the garden. When first we got in here, he said, it seemed like everything was gray. Look around now and tell me if it doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, she cried, the gray wall is changing. It's as if a green mist are creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil. Ah, said Dickon, and it'll be greener and greener till the gray's all gone. Can you guess what I was thinking? I know it was something nice, said Mary eagerly. I believe it was something about Colin. I was thinking that if he was out here, he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on the bushes, and he'd likely be healthier, explained Dickon. I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humor to come out here and lie under the trees in his carriage. I've been wondering that myself. I've thought of it almost every time I've talked to him, said Mary. I wondered if he could help keep a secret, and I wondered if we could bring him here without anyone seeing. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and he wants us to take him out. No one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he will go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out. Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. It'd be good for him, I'll warrant, he said. Us'd not be thinking he'd better never been born. Us'd be just two children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. Two lads and a little lass looking at the springtime. I warrant it'd be better than the doctor's stuff. He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back that it made him queer, said Mary. He knows a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything. He says he's been too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it is a secret. I dare not tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it. Us'll have him out here sometime for sure, said Dickon. I could push his carriage well enough. Hast thou noticed how the robin and his mate have been working while we've been sitting here? Look at him perched on that branch, wondering where it'd be best to put that twig he's got in his beak. He made one of his low whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of friendly advice. Wherever you put it, he said, it'll be all right. Yet thou know how to build a nest before they came out of the egg. Get on with it, lad. They've got no time to lose. Oh, I'd dear like to hear you talk to him, Mary said, laughing delightedly. Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he understood every word. And I know he likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited he would rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed. Dickon laughed too and went on talking. Thou knows this won't trouble thee, he said to the robin, us being near wild things ourselves. Us is nest building too. Bless thee. Look out that doesn't tell on us. And though the robin did not answer because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to his corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eye meant that he would not tell their secret for the world. Chapter 16. I won't, said Mary. They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and was also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. Tell Colin I can't come and see him yet, she said to Martha. I'm very busy in the garden. Martha looked rather frightened. Oh, Miss Mary, she said, it may put him all out of humor when I tell him that. But Mary was not afraid of him as other people were, and she was not a self-sacrificing person. I can't stay, she answered. Dickon's waiting for me, and she ran away. The afternoon was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already nearly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden, and most of the roses and trees had been pruned or dug about. Dickon had brought a spade of his own, and he taught Mary to use all their tools, so that by the time it was plain that the lovely wild place was not likely become a gardener's garden, it would be a wilderness of growing things before the springtime was over. There'll be apple blossoms and cherry blossoms overhead, Dickon said, working away with all his might. And there'll be peach and plum trees in bloom against the walls, and the grass will be a carpet of flowers. The little fox and the rook were as happy and busy as they were, and the robin and his mate flew backward and forward like tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped his black wings and soared away over the treetops in the park. Each time he came back and perched over Dickon and cawed several times, as if he was relating his adventures. And Dickon talked to him just as he had talked to the robin. Once when Dickon was so busy that he did not answer him at first, Soot flew on his shoulders and gently tweaked his ear with his large beak. When Mary wanted to rest a little, Dickon sat down with her under a tree, and once he took his pipe out of his pocket and played the soft, strange little notes, and two squirrels appeared on the wall and looked and listened. That's a good bit stronger than thou was, Dickon says, looking at her as she was digging. Thou beginning to look different, for sure. Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits. I'm getting fatter and fatter every day, she said, quite exultantly. Mrs. Medlock will have to get me some bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It isn't so flat and stringy. The sun was beginning to set, and sending deep golden-colored rays under the trees when they parted. "It'll be fine tomorrow," said Dickon. "I'll be at work by sunrise." "So will I," said Mary. She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet would carry her. She wanted to tell Colin about Dickon's fox cub and the rook and about what the springtime had been doing. She felt sure he would like to hear. So it was not very pleasant when she opened the door of her room to see Martha standing, waiting for her with a doleful face. "What's the matter?" she asked. "What did Colin say when you told him I couldn't come?" "Ugh," said Martha. "I wish thou'd gone. He was nigh going on in one of his tantrums. There's been a nice to do all afternoon to keep him quiet. He would watch the clock all the time." Mary's lips pinched themselves together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin was, and she was no reason why an ill-tempered boy should interfere with the things she liked best. She knew nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous and who did not know that they could control their tempers and need not make other people ill and nervous too. When she had a headache in India, she'd done her best to see that everybody else had a headache, or something quite as bad, and she felt as she was quite right. But of course now she felt that Colin was quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went into his room. He was lying flat on his back in bed, and he did not turn his head toward her as she came in. This was a bad beginning, and Mary marched up to him with her stiff manner. "Why didn't you get up?" she said. "I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered without looking at her. "I made him put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached and my head ached and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was working in the garden with Dickon," said Mary. Colin frowned and condescended to look at her. "I won't let that boy come here if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me," he said. Mary flew into a fine passion. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate and did not care what happened. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again," she retorted. "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you," said Colin. "They shall drag you in." "Shall they, Mr. Rajah?" said Mary fiercely. "They may drag me in, but they can't make me talk when they get me here. I'll sit and clench my teeth and never tell you one thing. I won't even look at you. I'll stare at the floor." They were a nice, agreeable pair as they glared at each other. If they had been two little street boys, they would have sprung at each other and had a rough-and-tumble fight. As it was, they did the next thing to it. "You are a selfish thing," cried Colin. "Well, what are you?" said Mary. "Selfish people always say that. Anyone is selfish who doesn't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I ever saw." "I am not," snapped Colin. "I'm not selfish as your fine Dickon is. He keeps you playing in the dirt when he knows I'm all by myself. He's selfish, if you like." Mary's eyes flashed fire. "He's nicer than any boy that ever lived," she said. He's like an angel." It might sound rather silly to say that, but she did not care. "A nice angel," Colin sneered ferociously. "He's a common cottage boy off the moor." "He's better than a common Rajah," retorted Mary. "He's 1,000 times better." Because she was the stronger of the two, she was beginning to get the better of him. The truth was that he had never had a fight with anyone like himself in his life, and upon the whole it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew anything about that. He turned his head on his pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear was squeezed out and ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for anyone else. "I'm not as selfish as you, because I'm always ill, and I'm sure there is a lump coming on my back," he said, "and I am going to die besides." "You are not," contradicted Mary, unsympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard such a thing said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased if a person could be both at one time. "I'm not," he cried. "I am. You know I am. Everybody says so. I don't believe it, said Mary sourly. You just say that to make people sorry. I believe you're proud of it. I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy, it might be true. But you're too nasty. In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage. Get out of the room, he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and he threw it at her. He was not strong enough to throw it far, and it only fell at her feet. But Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker. I'm going, she said, and I won't come back. She walked to the door, and when she reached it, she turned around and spoke again. I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things, she said. Dickon brought this fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them. Now I won't tell you a single thing. She marched out of the door and closed it behind her, and there, to her great astonishment, she found the trained nurse standing, as if she'd been listening. And more amazing still, she was laughing. She was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse at all, as she could not bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone else who would take her place. Mary never liked her, and she simply stood and gazed up at her as she stood giggling into her handkerchief. What are you laughing at? She asked her. At you two young'uns, said the nurse. It's the best thing that could happen to that sickly, pampered thing to have come someone stand up to him that he's as spoiled as himself. And she laughed into her handkerchief again. If I'd had a young vixen of a sister to fight with, it would have been the saving of him. Is he going to die? I don't know, and I don't care, said the nurse. Hysterics and temper are half of what ails him. What are hysterics? Asked Mary. You'll find out if you work him into a tantrum after this, but at any rate, you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad of it. Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she had come in from the garden. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. She'd looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she meant to try to make up her mind whether it'd be safe to trust him with the secret garden. She'd beginning to think it would be, but now she changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get a fresh air and die if he liked. It'd serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelenting that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil craping over the world and the soft wind blowing down from the moor. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been temporarily replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover had been removed and revealed that it was full of neat packages. Mr. Craven sent it to you, said Martha. It looks as if it had picture books in it. Mary remembered that he asked her the day she had gone to his room. Do you want anything? Dolls, toys, books? She opened the package, wondering if he had sent a doll, and also wondering what she should do with it if he had. But he had not sent one. There were several beautiful books, such as Colin had, and 2 of them were about gardens and full of pictures. There were 2 or 3 games, and there was a beautiful little writing case with a gold monogram on it and a gold pen and inkstand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd out her anger out of her mind. She not expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart grew quite warm. I can write better than I can print, she said, and the first thing I shall write with that pen will be a letter to tell him I am much obliged, which is the old-fashioned way of saying thank you. If she had been friends with Colin, she would have run to show him her presents at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the gardening books, and perhaps tried playing the games, and he would have enjoyed himself so much that he never would have thought that he was going to die or have put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump growing. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable, frightened feeling because he always looked so frightened himself. He said that if he even felt a little lump someday, he would know that his hunch had begun to grow. Something he had heard Mrs. Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him the idea, and he thought over it in secret until it was quite firmly fixed in his mind. Mrs. Medlock had said that his father's back had begun to show its crookedness in that way when he was a child. He never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, as they called them, grew out of his hysterical hidden fear. Mary had been sorry for him when he told her. He always began to think about it when he was cross or tired, she said to herself. And he has been cross today. Perhaps he's been thinking about it all afternoon. She stood still, looking down at the carpet and thinking. I said I would never go back again, she hesitated, knitting her brows. But perhaps, just perhaps, I'll go and see, if he wants me, in the morning. Perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again. But I think I'll go. Chapter 17. A Tantrum. She got up very early in the morning and worked hard in the garden, and she was tired and sleepy. So as soon as Martha had brought her supper and she had eaten it, she was glad to go to bed. As she laid her head on the pillow, she murmured to herself, I'll go out before breakfast and work with Dickon, and then afterward, I believe, I'll go to see him. She thought it was the middle of the night when she was awakened by such dreadful sounds that she jumped out of bed in an instant. What was it? What was it? The next minute, she quite sure she knew. Doors were open and shut, and they were hurrying feet in the corridors. And someone was crying and screaming at the same time, screaming and crying in a horrible way. It's Colin, she said. He's having one of those tantrums, and the nurse called hysterics. How awful it sounds. As she listened to the sobbing screams, she did not wonder that people were so frightened that they gave him his own way in everything rather than hear him. She put her hands over her ears and felt sick and shivering. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, she kept saying. I can't bear it. Once she wondered if he would stop if she dared go to him, and then she remembered how he had driven her out of the room and thought that perhaps the sight of her might make him worse. Even when she pressed her hands more tightly over her ears, she could not keep the awful sounds out. She hated them so and was terrified by them that suddenly they began to make her angry, and she felt as if she should like to fly into a tantrum herself and frighten him as he were frightening her. She was not used to anyone's tempers but her own. She took her hands from her ears and sprang up and stamped her foot. He ought to be stopped. Somebody ought to make him stop. Somebody ought to beat him, she cried out. Just then she heard feet running down the corridor, and her door opened and the nurse came in. She was not laughing now by any means. She even looked rather pale. He's worked himself into hysterics, she said in a great hurry. He'll do himself harm. No one can do anything with him. You come and try, like a good child. He likes you. He turned me out of the room this morning, said Mary, stamping her foot with excitement. The stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was that she'd been afraid she might find Mary crying and hiding her head under her bedclothes. That's right, she said. You're in the right humor. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as ever you can. It was not until afterward that Mary realized that the thing had been funny as well as dreadful, that it was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened that they came to a little girl just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin himself. She flew along the corridor, and the nearer she got to the screams, the higher her temper mounted. She felt quite wicked by the time she reached the door. She slapped it open with her hand and ran across the room to the four-poster bed. You stop, she almost shouted. You stop. I hate you. Everybody hates you. I wish everybody would run out of this house and let you scream yourself to death. You will scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would. A nice, sympathetic child could neither have thought nor said such things, but it happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for this hysterical boy, whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict. He'd been lying on his face, beating his pillow with his hands, and he actually almost jumped around. He turned so quickly at the sound of this furious little voice. His face looked dreadful, white and red and swollen, and he was gasping and choking. But savage little Mary did not care an atom. If you scream another scream, she said, I'm going to scream too. And I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you. I'll frighten you. He actually stopped screaming because she had startled him so. The scream which had been coming almost choked him. The tears were streaming down his face, and he shook all over. I can't stop, he gasped and sobbed. I can't. You can, shouted Mary. Half that ails you is hysterics and temper. Hysterics, hysterics, hysterics. And she stamped each time she said it. I felt the lump, I felt it, choked out Colin. I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall die. And he began to writhe again and turned on his face and sobbed and wailed, but he didn't scream. You didn't feel a lump, contradicted Mary fiercely. If you did, it was only an hysterical lump. Hysterics make lumps. There's nothing the matter with your horrid back, nothing but hysterics. Now turn over and let me look at it. She liked the word hysterics and felt somehow as if it had an effect on him. He was probably like herself, and he'd never heard it before. Nurse, she commanded, come here and show me his back this minute. The nurse, Mrs. Medlock, and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door, staring at her, their mouths half open. All three had gasped with fright more than once. The nurse came forward as if she were half afraid. Colin was heaving with great breathless sobs. Perhaps he won't let me, she hesitated in a low voice. Colin heard her out her, and he gasped out between two sobs. Show her, she'll see them. It was a poor thin back to look at when it was bared. Every rib could be counted and every joint of the spine, though Mistress Mary did not count them as she bent over and examined them with a solemn, savage little face. She looked so sour and old-fashioned that the nurse turned her head aside to hide the twitching of her mouth. There was just a minute's silence, for even Colin tried to hold his breath while Mary looked up and down his spine, and down and up, as intently as she had been a great doctor from London. There's not a single lump here, she said. There's not a lump as big as a pin, except backbone lumps, and you can only feel them because you're thin. I got backbone lumps myself, and they used to stick out as much as yours until I got fatter, and I'm not fat enough yet to hide them. There's not a lump as big as a pin. If you ever say that again, I shall laugh. No one but Colin himself knew what effect those crossly spoken childish words had on him. If he had ever had anyone talk to him about his secret terrors, if he ever dared to let himself ask questions, and if he had childish companions and had not lain on his back in the huge closed house, breathing an atmosphere heavy with the fears of people who were most of them ignorant and tired of him, he would have found out that most of his fright and illness was created by himself. But he had lain and thought of himself and his aches and weariness for hours and days and months and years. And now, that an angry, unsympathetic little girl insisted obstinately that he was not ill, and as he thought he was, he actually felt as if she might be speaking the truth. I didn't know, ventured the nurse, that he thought he had a lump on his spine. His back is weak because he won't try to sit up. I could have told him there was no lump there. Colin gulped and turned his face a little to look at her. Could you? He said pathetically. Yes, sir. There, said Mary, and she gulped too. Colin turned on his face again, but for his long-drawn broken breaths, which were the dying down of his storm of sobbing, he lay still for a minute, though great tears streamed down his face and wet the pillow. Actually, the tears meant that a curious great relief had come to him. Presently he turned and looked at the nurse again, and strangely enough, he was not like a Rajah at all as he spoke to her. Do you think I could live to grow up? He said. The nurse was neither clever nor soft-hearted, but she could repeat some of London's doctor's words. You probably will if you will do what you are told to do, and not give way to your temper, and stay out a great deal in the fresh air. Colin's tantrum had passed, and he was weak and worn out with crying, and this perhaps made him feel gentle. He put out his hand toward Mary, and I'm glad to say that her own tantrum having passed, she was softened too, and met him halfway with her hand, so that it was sort of a making up. I'll go out with you, Mary, he said. I shan't hate fresh air if we can find... He remembered just in time to stop from saying, if we can find the secret garden, and he ended, I shall like to go out with you if Dickon will come and push my chair. I do so want to see Dickon and the fox and the crow. The nurse remade the tumbled bed and shook and straightened the pillows. Then she made Colin a cup of beef tea and gave a cup to Mary, who really was glad to get it after her excitement. Mrs. Medlock and Martha gladly slipped away, and after everything was neat and calm and in order, the nurse looked as if she would gladly slip away also. She was a healthy young woman who resented being robbed of her sleep, and she yawned quite openly as she looked at Mary, who had pushed her big footstool close to the four-poster bed and was holding Colin's hand. "You must go back and get your sleep out," she said. "He'll drop off after a while if he's not too upset. Then I'll lie down myself in the next room." "Would you like me to sing you a song that I learned from my ayah?" Mary whispered to Colin. Now remember, ayah was like her nanny. His hand pulled hers gently, and he turned his tired eyes on her appealingly. "Oh, yes," he answered. "It's such a soft song, I shall go to sleep in a minute." "I will put him to sleep," Mary said to the yawning nurse. "You can go if you like." "Well," said the nurse with an attempt at reluctance, "if he doesn't go to sleep in half an hour, you must call me." "Very well," answered Mary. The nurse was out of the room in a minute, and as soon as she was gone, Colin pulled Mary's hand again. "I almost told," he said, "but I stopped myself in time. I won't talk and I'll go to sleep. But you said you had a whole lot of things to tell me. Have you? Do you think you found out anything at all about the way into the secret garden?" Mary looked at the poor little tired face and the swollen eyes, and her eyes relented. "Yes," she answered, "I think I have. And if you will go to sleep, I will tell you tomorrow." His hand quite trembled. "Oh, Mary," he said, "Mary, if I could get into that, I think I should live to grow up. Do you suppose that instead of singing that ayah song, you could just tell me softly, as you did the first day, what you imagine it looks like inside? I'm sure it'll make me go to sleep." "Yes," answered Mary. "Shut your eyes." He closed his eyes and lay quite still, and she held his hand and began to speak very slowly and in a low voice. "I think it has been left alone so long that it has grown into a lovely tangle. I think the roses have climbed and climbed and climbed until they hang from the branches and walls and creep over the ground, almost like a strange gray mist. Some of them have died, but many are alive, and when the summer comes, there will be curtains and fountains of roses. I think the ground is full of daffodils and snowdrops and lilies and iris working their way out of the dark. Now the spring has begun. Perhaps. The soft drone of her voice was making him stiller and stiller, and she saw it and went on. "Perhaps they're coming through the grass. Perhaps there are clusters of purple crocuses and gold ones even now. Perhaps the leaves are beginning to break out and uncurl. And perhaps the gray is changing and a green gauze veil is creeping and creeping over everything. And the birds are coming to look at it because it is so safe and still. And perhaps, very softly and slowly indeed, the robin has found a mate and is building a nest." And Colin was asleep. Chapter 18. Thou must not waste no time. Of course, Mary did not waken early the next morning. She slept late because she was tired. And when Martha brought her breakfast, she told her that Colin was quite quiet, and he was ill and feverish, he always was after he'd worn himself out with a fit of crying. Mary ate her breakfast slowly as she listened. "He says he wishes you would please go and see him as soon as you can," Martha said. "It's queer what a fancy he took to you. Thou did give him last night for sure, didn't thou? Nobody else would have dared to do that. Oh, the poor lad, he's been spoiled till salt won't save him. Mother says the two worst things that can happen to a child is never to have his own way or always to have it. She doesn't know which is the worst. Thou was in a fine temper thyself, too. But he says to me when I went into his room, 'Please ask Miss Mary, if she'll come and talk to me.' Think of him saying, 'Please, will you, miss?' 'I'll run and see Dickon first,' said Mary. 'No, I'll go and see Colin first and tell him. I know what I'll tell him,' with a sudden inspiration. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room, and for a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed. His face was pitifully white, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "I'm glad you came," he said. "My head aches, and I ache all over because I'm so tired. Are you going somewhere?" Mary went and leaned against his bed. "I won't be long," she said. "I'm going to Dickon, but I'll come back. Colin, it's something about the garden. His whole face brightened and a little color came into it. Oh, is it? He cried out. I've dreamed about it all night. I heard you say something about gray changing to green, and I dreamed I was standing in a place filled with trembling little green leaves, and that there were birds on nests everywhere, and they looked so soft and still. I'll lie and think about it until you come back. In 5 minutes, Mary was with Dickon in their garden. The fox and the crow were with him again, and this time he brought 2 tame squirrels. I came over on the pony this morning, he said. He's a good little chap, Jump is. I brought these 2 in my pockets. This here one we call Nuttin', and this one is called Shell. When he said Nut, one squirrel leaped onto his right shoulder, and when he said Shell, the other one leaped onto his left shoulder. When they sat down on the grass with Captain curled at their feet, Soot solemnly listening on a tree, and Nut and Shell nosing about close to them, it seemed to Mary that it would be scarcely bearable to leave such delightfulness. But when she began to tell her story, somehow the look in Dickon's funny face gradually changed her mind. She could see he felt sorrier for Colin than she did. He looked up at the sky and all about it. Just listen to the birds. The world seems full of them, all whistling and piping, he said. Look at 'em darting around and hearkening and calling to each other. Come springtime, seems like as the world's calling. The leaves is uncurling so you can see 'em, and the world and the nice smells there is about, sniffing with its happy turned-up nose. And that poor lad just lying there, seeing so little that he gets to thinking, and things as sets him screaming. Oh my! We must get him out here. We must get him watching and listening and sniffing in the air and get him soaked through with sunshine. And we must not lose no time about it. When he was very much interested, he often spoke quite broad Yorkshire, though at times he tried to modify his dialect so that Mary could better understand. But she loved his broad Yorkshire and had in fact been trying to learn to speak it herself, so she spoke a little now. Now, I'm not saying this in totally Yorkshire because without the print, you'll not understand if I tried to say it. Aye, that we mun, she said, which meant yes, indeed we must. I'll tell thee what us'll do first, she proceeded, and Dickon grinned, because when the little wench tried to twist her tongue into speaking Yorkshire, it amused him very much. He's took a great fancy to thee. He wants to see thee, and he wants to see Soot and Captain. When I go back to the house to talk to him, I'll ask him if he can come and see him tomorrow morning, and bring the creatures with thee. And then in a bit, when there's more leaves out and happen a bud or 2, we'll get him to come and they'll push him in his chair and we'll bring him in here and show him everything. When she stopped, she was quite proud of herself. She never made a long speech in Yorkshire before, and she remembered very well. Thou mun talk a bit of Yorkshire like that to Mr. Colin, Dickon chuckled. Thou'll make him laugh, and there's nowt as good for ill folk as laughing is. Mother says she believes a half an hour's good laugh every morning 'ud cure a chap as when making ready for typhus fever. I'm going to talk Yorkshire to him this very day, said Mary, chuckling herself. The garden had reached the time when every day and every night it seemed as if magicians were passing through it, drawing loveliness out of the earth and the boughs with wands. It was hard to go away and leave it all, particularly as Nut had actually crept onto her dress, and Shell had scrambled down the trunk of the apple tree that sat under, and stayed there looking at her with inquiring eyes. But she went back to the house, and when she sat down close to Colin's bed, he began to sniff as Dickon did, though not in such an experienced way. You smell like flowers and fresh things, he cried out quite joyously. What is it you smell of? It's cool and warm and sweet all at the same time. It's the wind from the moor, said Mary. It comes a-sittin' on the grass under a tree with Dickon and with Cap'n and with Soot and Nut and Shell. It's the springtime and out-of-doors and sunshine as smells so gravely. She said it as broadly as she could, and you do not know how broadly Yorkshire sounds until you have heard someone speak it. Colin began to laugh. What are you doing? He said. I never heard you talk like that before. How funny it sounds. I'm giving thee a bit o' Yorkshire. answered Mary triumphantly. I can talk as greatly as Dickon and Martha can, but thou sees I can shape a bit. Doesn't thou understand a bit of Yorkshire when they hears it? And thou a Yorkshire and a little bred and outborn? I wonder if thou not ashamed of thy face. And then she began to laugh too, and they both laughed until they could not stop themselves, and they laughed until the room echoed, and Mrs. Medlock, opening the door to come in, drew back into the corridor and stood listening, amazed. Well, upon my word, she said, speaking rather broad Yorkshire herself, because there's no one to hear her, and she was so astonished. Whoever heard the like? Whoever on earth would have thought of it? There was so much to talk about, it seemed as if Colin could never hear enough of Dickon and Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell and the pony whose name was Jump. Mary had run into the wood with Dickon to see Jump. He was a tiny little shaggy moor pony with thick locks hanging over his eyes and a pretty face and a nuzzling velvet nose. He was rather thin, with living on moor grass, but he was as tough and wiry as if the muscle in his little legs had been made of steel springs. He lifted his head and whinnied softly the moment he saw Dickon, and he trotted up to him and put his head across his shoulder, and then Dickon had talked into his ear, and Jump had talked back in on odd little whinnies and puffs and sorts. Dickon had made him give Mary his small front hoof and kiss her on the cheek with his velvet muzzle. Does he really understand everything Dickon says? Colin asked. It seems as if he does, answered Mary. Dickon says anything we'll understand if you're friends with it for sure, but you have to be friends for sure. Colin lay quiet a little while, and his strange gray eyes seemed to be staring at the wall, but Mary saw that he was thinking. I wish I was friends with things, he said at last, but I'm not. I never have anything to be friends with, and I can't bear people. Can't you bear me? Asked Mary. Well, yes, I can, he answered. It's funny, but I even like you. Ben Weatherstaff said I was like him, said Mary. He said he'd warrant we'd both get the same nasty tempers. I think you're like him, too. We are all three alike, you and I and Ben Weatherstaff. He said he was neither of us much to look at, and we were as sour as we looked. But I don't feel as sour as I used to before I knew the Robin and Dickon. Do you feel as if you hated people? Yes, answered Mary without any affection. I should have detested you if I had not seen you before I saw the Robin and Dickon. Colin put out his thin hand and touched her. Mary, he said, I wish I hadn't said what I did about sending Dickon away. I hated you when you said he was like an angel, and I laughed at you, but perhaps he is. Well, it was rather funny to say it, she admitted frankly, because his nose does turn up, and he has a big mouth, and his clothes have patches all over them, and he talks broad Yorkshire. But if an angel did come to Yorkshire and live on the moor, and if there was a Yorkshire angel, I believe he'd understand the green things, and I know how to make them grow, and he would know how to talk to the wild creatures as Dickon does, and they know that he was friends for sure. I shouldn't mind Dickon looking at me, said Colin. I want to see him. I'm glad you said that, answered Mary, because quite suddenly it came into her mind that this was the minute to tell him. Colin knew something new was coming. Because what? He cried eagerly. Mary was so anxious she got up from her stool and came to him and caught hold of both of his hands. Can I trust you? I trusted Dickon because birds trusted him. Can I trust you for sure? For sure, she implored. Her face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. Yes, yes. Well, Dickon will come to see you tomorrow morning, and he'll bring his treasures with him. Oh, cried Colin in delight. But that's not all, Mary went on, almost pale with solemn excitement. The rest is better. There is a door into the garden, and I found it. It's under the ivy on the wall. If he had been a strong, healthy boy, Colin would probably have shouted, hooray, hooray! But he was weak and rather hysterical. His eyes grew bigger and bigger, and he gasped for breath. Oh, Mary, he cried with a half sob. Shall I see it? Shall I get into it? Shall I live to get into it? And he clutched her hands and dragged her toward him. Of course you'll see it, snapped Mary indignantly. Of course you'll live to get into it. Now don't be silly. And she was so unhysterical and natural and childish that she brought him to his senses, and he began to laugh at himself, and a few minutes afterwards she was sitting on her stool again, telling him not what she imagined the secret garden to be like, but what it really was. And Colin's aches and tiredness were forgotten, and he was listening enraptured. "It's just what you thought it would be," he said at last. "It sounds just as if you had really seen it. You know, I said that when you told me first." Mary hesitated about 2 minutes, and then boldly spoke the truth. "I had seen it, and I had been in it," she said. "I found the key and got in weeks ago, but I dare not tell you. I dare not because I was so afraid I couldn't trust you, for sure."